We can start the proceedings now. Good morning, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be with the Indore group. We have been organizing
दुबे सर और प्रोफेसर कृष्णा सर अपने आप को अनम्यूट कर लें, वैसे कोस्ट बना दिया उनको.
So I want to welcome everyone and a special welcome to Prof P Krishna, who is our guest speaker today. Prof Krishna hardly needs any introduction, but we have a custom of telling briefly about the speaker, so I'll briefly say something about Professor Krishna, even though the Indore group is fully aware about his credentials. Professor Krishna is a physicist. He was professor and head of department in the Department of Physics, Varanasi University till 1985. He has been a research fellow in almost all important physical laboratories of the world, and also as a visiting professor in many famous universities around the globe. He has the privilege of working with quite a few Nobel Laureates, and to his credit, he has more than 100 research publications in Indian and international journals. In 1985, Krishna Ji invited him to come to Rajghat and become the principal of the school and run the center. So Professor Krishna resigned his position in Varanasi University and joined as rector of Rajghat Education Centre and also principal of the school. And he has remained more or less associated with Rajghat all these years. He is one of the senior most trustees of the Krishnamurti Foundation in India. And till about a year ago, he was actively associated with administrative responsibilities of Krishnamurti Study Centre in Rajghat, but he has withdrawn from all administrative work and a very sought after speaker in all parts of the world. Professor Krishna travels widely for giving talks on Krishna's teachings. With these few words, I welcome Professor Krishna once again. So the format you know already, you have spoken to us earlier. You can speak for 50 minutes to an hour. And after that, Professor Gajanan Rao will make some observations. And then the floor will be open for anybody to ask questions. So with these words, I'll request Professor Krishna to please, sir, come and start your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dubeji, for those kind words of introduction, reminding me of my past. Krishna Ji laid great stress on freedom from conditioning. He said that that is the first necessity. Before that, learning does not even begin. He was, of course, talking of the learning as self-knowledge, which is the discernment of what is true and what is false. One must differentiate that from the learning of knowledge and skills, which is a process of adding to the memory. It's called accumulative learning, whereas self-knowledge is really a process of unlearning the false in the mind. And that is what brings about a transformation of consciousness. The other learning which we go through in school and college and university is really a matter of accumulating intellectual skills and properties and property. That does not transform consciousness. It gives you certain abilities and so on. So we are familiar with all that. So this freedom from conditioning is connected with the transformation of consciousness, which is connected with the learning as self-knowledge. And Krishna Ji said self-knowledge is the key to wisdom. So we must ask ourselves, what is meant by conditioning and by freedom from conditioning? Now there are two parts to our consciousness of every human being. One, I would call the universal part, which is connected with the body, the brain, the senses, the capacity for awareness, for acquiring knowledge, for learning language, the capacity for memory and imagination and thinking, which is common to all human beings. Not what they think, but thinking is common to all human beings. All human beings can think, they can imagine, they have memory, they have all the instincts which have come to us, the biological instincts we have in common. So all that is part of nature's order. We are born with it. Every human being is born with it. Subsequently, he may cultivate one part more than another, but basically we all stand on the same ground. It's like different trees are all trees. They have much in common. They all stand on the same ground, but they are not identical. In the same way, human beings are not identical, but they stand on the same ground, basically very similar. So Krishna Ji even went to the extent of saying that the other man is yourself. And the fact that you don't see that to be so is because there are a lot of illusions as constructs of your own thinking which prevent you from seeing this truth. It's like saying that we are all like identical IBM computers, only we are programmed differently. One is programmed as a Hindu, another as a Christian, another as an atheist or communist, and so on. And we give a lot of importance to this programming and therefore feel separate from each other. Now that program is the conditioning, not the biological program, which runs in our body, which is part of nature's order. So all that is part of the universal, which is there. We are born with it. Then there is the personal, which is accumulated from the time of our birth. It depends on where one is born, which family, which culture, which country, which religion. and so on, the environment. And the child imbibes from that environment a particular language, certain moral values, certain religious beliefs, and so on. All that is part of the personal conditioning, which varies from individual to individual. It includes our experiences, our knowledge, which we acquire in school or college, or through one's own personal experience. All that is stored in the brain. The brain is an organ which does its work of recording all this, and it also records psychological pleasures and psychological pains, hurts, and so on. So there is both the psychological memory and the factual memory of what actually took place. All that is conditioning acquired after birth and is personal to each individual. Then, if you identify yourself with your particular conditioning, it brings about a state which we call the ego state. That is an attachment to the me and the mind. And it creates likes and dislikes. It influences one's thinking in terms of what is beneficial for the me and the mind, what is harmful to the me and the mind. And the mind gets hijacked in a state in which it is constantly interested in defending the me and the mind and working for its safety and its victory, or for the propagation of the ideas or the ideology with which it has identified itself. And all that is the ego process, the creation of a separate self. Not only separate because it is different, but also because it is divided from others. So one has to examine this whole area in order to understand how this conditioning comes about and what it does to our thinking, and why Krishna Ji lays so much stress on freedom from conditioning. When that conditioning is held in memory in the brain, which I cannot wipe out, and there is a lot that is quite factual in it, not illusory at all, which is useful, which I need, like the language which I speak, or other skills which are there and so on, which one has acquired. They don't create any division, any like or dislike, any hatred. So you don't need to get rid of them. Therefore, freedom from conditioning does not obviously mean absence of conditioning, because absence of conditioning carried to the extreme would mean amnesia. And one doesn't want that's not what one is talking of. So what does freedom from conditioning mean? Because conditioning seems to be such a natural process. After all, one is born in a particular family, grows up there as a child. One must also examine how this ego process starts, because that's not part of nature. It's not, there is no ego anywhere in nature, neither in the rivers, nor the galaxies, nor the trees, nor the animals. And the human child, which is newborn, is free from the ego. So it's a kind of psychological process that is acquired subsequently, which turns differences into divisions and creates hatred and all kinds of negative emotions. So I think that when you talk about freedom from conditioning, one is talking about the ending of this psychological process of the formation of the ego and of the identification with a particular country or a particular belief or a particular ideology and so on, which then divides you from other people belonging to other countries and so on, because you feel you identify with it, and therefore you are only interested in furthering the interests of the me and the mine. So self-interest develops in the maintenance of the me and the mine, and the profit of the me and the mine, and the defense of the me and the mine. Now this whole thing is a psychological process which occurs only in the human consciousness. So we have to understand this, because this is the source of all conflict and all division. It starts with feeling I am a separate individual, separate from the other, and of feeling superior. My culture is superior, my country is superior, my religion is superior to your religion, and so on. So there is this whole process by which this takes place, and that is the source of all the negative emotions like hatred and anger and jealousy and comparison and competition and rivalry and so on, which we all experience. So you don't need to free yourself of the factual part, but one needs to free oneself of this psychological part, which is the creation of the human mind. Maybe in some of the higher animals, it may be there to some small extent. We don't know about the state of the mind of the animal. But we are basically concerned with our own problems in our life, and they originate from this process. So when Krishna Ji talks about freedom from conditioning, I understand that he is asking us to free ourselves of this psychological process. Now, to free yourself of anything, you need to understand that. And to understand that, you must not suppress it or escape from it or denigrate it. You must look at it. So let's look at how this psychological process develops. If the child is not born with it, how does it arise in the consciousness of the child? The human child is extremely dependent. It has almost no way of protecting itself other than being attached to its parents and the parents looking after it. And this is so not for a small period like 3 months or 6 months. In the case of animals, the young ones become independent of the parents in a short time, within 6 months or a year. In the case of a human being, it takes almost 20 years before that human being can function independently as an individual in society. So this process is necessary in the beginning. Even in the animals, the young one of an animal clings to its mother One has observed that because it depends on the mother. The young child of a human being clings similarly to the mother and the father and feels secure in his home. It's therefore natural for him to develop an attachment for this particular family and its ways. And he feels separate from other people belonging to other families and having other ways. So this development of the ego is a natural process, and natural in the sense that it occurs in all human beings. And in the beginning, it's necessary. If the child didn't have that, he might just wander off from home. And because of his attachment, he is protected. He remains attached to the home, and the home protects him. That's a place where he feels safe. So what do we mean by freedom from conditioning? If that is necessary to begin with, as the child grows, just as a young baby needs to be attached to the breast of the mother for its source of milk. But eventually, you have to wean the child away from the breast so that he becomes independent of the mother for his diet. In the same way, the question arises whether one is permanently trapped in this ego state of childhood, of the attachment and the identification with the family, the religion, the nationality, the language, and so on. And therefore, the trap of the ego sets in, or can one move away from it? Can one wean oneself away from this? Since it's a process that occurs in every child, it is necessary to understand this process, and through understanding this process, go beyond it. That is what I understand as freedom from conditioning. And Krishna Ji said that's not just the first step, it is also the last step. Because once you free yourself of the conditioning, it becomes a learning mind. And the learning mind, there is no limits to that learning, to that self-knowledge. It can come to any level of wisdom, wherever that takes you. But before that, you are incapable of the quest for truth, because you are viewing everything through your conditioning, and the conditioning colors your thinking, your reactions, and you're not interested in the truth. So if self-knowledge is the quest for truth and the ending of the false, then it can only take place through freeing oneself of this screen of conditioning. And the reason one can free oneself is because it's a psychological process, self-created, may be necessary in childhood, but if you continue with it throughout life, it imprisons you into a narrow mind, which is only interested in the me and the mind, and separates itself from the rest of the universe. The religious quest is for freeing oneself from this limited state or prison as of conditioning, and having therefore a global mind or a global concern. For that, it is necessary to realize that though it gives the feeling that this identification gives me security, that feeling is illusory. You do feel secure in belonging to a particular caste because you feel that your caste people are your friends and they will help you and so on, and you identify with them, or with a particular religion or a political ideology. You create a community to which you belong, a group to which you belong, and it does feel that it's giving you a certain status, a certain identity, which defends you, which protects you, and so on. But it divides you from other similar groups and creates division, from which comes conflict. And when that conflict grows because of self-interest, it eventually turns into war or rioting or terrorism. All these evils that we find in society. There have been more wars in the name of religion than even for territory or property. That becomes a very travesty of anything that can be truly called religious. So it's a really serious problem. And yet, the individual is not aware of this because he feels protection in belonging to that group, whether it be a caste group or a linguistic group or a political group or even a scientific group, ideological group. He feels protected, he gets importance in that group and so on. So it feeds the ego of the individual. That's the whole process of this division. So unless one engages in understanding this damaging aspect of this process, one doesn't really feel convinced that one needs to free oneself of this. It's only when you can see with a long vision that you see the damage that comes out of separating yourself into groups. I'm not talking of innocent groups like teachers in a school or workers in a hospital or in a post office. You do have to form such groups in order to work cooperatively with other people for achieving anything in life. But these ideological groups which cause division, the schools don't cause division, hospitals don't cause division, they don't cause war. So one has to understand this process, that while our conditionings are different, because we have grown up in a different environment, each one, our knowledge is different, our experiences are different, our language is different, our taste in food is different, and so on. Difference is something very natural. No two things are completely identical in nature. Not even two leaves belonging to the same tree are identical. But in nature, these differences don't create division, don't create conflict, except very limited conflict which comes instinctively because certain species are predatory and consume other species as food. But no animals or no plants have created war and tried to decimate the whole community or whole species of another, which is what is the problem with the human beings. So we must not always link ourselves with the state of the animal, because we are in a much more dangerous state. This ego creates war and creates much greater havoc. It accumulates power with a view to destroy the other. No animal does that. No animal has created that kind of war or destruction as human beings have done. So it's a very serious problem. It originates from this ego process. And unless one frees oneself of this, you may talk about this endlessly, but you are contributing to that division in the world. These are Krishna Ji's words, not only mine. But if you see the truth of this, if you see the truth of the fact that the world is the way it is because we are the way we are, and you are aware of the sad state of the world, the divisions in the world, the cruelty and all that, particularly in human society. In nature, there is great harmony. The different species, the different trees, rivers, mountains, they all live harmoniously. They are in total order, nature's order, which science studies, the laws which govern that order. But the human consciousness doesn't have that order. The human body has that order. A million things happen in our body exactly as they should. All that we do is eat some food and take some exercise. I can't come. I can't come. I told him I'll talk to him on the phone. So it's a special problem of human being, and it originates from this psychological process which takes place. The conditioning is a fact. Each one of us has a personality. You can describe that personality. Even Krishna Ji had a personality. But what is different for the sage is the fact that he is not attached to it. He is not identified with it. It's not dominating in his consciousness. So there is no ego. That is a psychological process. And in order to free oneself of it, one has to learn about it by watching it operating in oneself. So the question that one must ask is, why does a difference create a division? After all, we are all different from each other. We are of different ages. We have different heights. We have different kind of looks and skin color. We have different languages. We have different property. So many differences. They don't create division. How does a difference turn into a division? And whether it's possible for us to see a difference only as a difference and not let it create division. When you examine that question, you will find that a difference turns into a division when you attach superiority and inferiority, certain value judgments, which are coming from your conditioning. From your conditioning, you are comparing, you are saying this is superior, that is inferior, mostly decided on the basis of self-interest. So those who agree with me are likable. Those who disagree with me, I dislike, which is based on self-interest. This kind of evaluation, measurement, comparison goes on all the time in the mind. That's what the ego process does. The thinking has been hijacked. Instead of wanting to discover what is true, it is discovering what is likable, what is supportive for me and the mind, what leads to greater safety for me and the mind. So from that identification and that angle, you are all the time looking. The mind becomes like a personal lawyer, all the time defending the me and the mind and looking for the profits for the me and the mind and the victory for the me and the mind. It's not interested in the truth. Therefore, it's not very easy to say honestly that one is in quest of truth, unless one has freed oneself of this process, which is a psychological process. Now, Krishna Ji said all disorder in consciousness arises from this illusion. It's illusions that give rise to disorder in our consciousness in the form of anger, jealousy, violence, hatred, and so on. And since they arise from illusion, the greatest illusion being this ego process, they can be ended, because illusion can be ended. Illusion can be ended by discerning what is true and what is false. And that is this quest for self-knowledge. Now, the difficulty is that the mind that is in illusion is not aware of its illusion, that it is in illusion. If it is aware of illusion, then it ceases to be in illusion. So the terrorist, we may think his mind is caught up in illusion, but to him, that's a fact, that he'll go to heaven if he kills in the name of God and so on, whatever. He takes that propaganda in his mind to be a fact. And he is acting on that fact. To Hitler, it was a fact that Nazis are a superior race, and if they were governing the whole world, we would create a better world. And therefore, you need to get rid of Jews and so on. He really believed in it. He was in illusion, but he was not aware that it's an illusion. He was acting on that. In the same way, we all also have illusions, and we are not aware of our illusions. That's why you cannot consciously end this through any kind of knowledge. Then, how to be free of this condition? Well, Krishna said, every time you experience disorder in consciousness, which is very perceptible, because sorrow, fear, conflict, violence, anger, it's very perceptible, it's painful. So you know that there is disorder in consciousness. You are aware of it. Normally, we try to suppress that. We try to escape from that. But he's saying, you won't get rid of it by escaping from it. You won't get rid of it by suppressing it. You can only get rid of it when you free yourself of the causation. And that causation is arising out of an illusion in your own mind. So the quest for truth or for self-knowledge is to discover the illusion from which that negative emotion is arising within you. And that's the process of self-knowledge. It's not really knowledge. It is a misnomer to call it knowledge. It is really sensing. You have to be watching, and you have to treat every negative emotion as an opportunity for learning about yourself by posing this question: from where did this arise in me? And if you can free yourself of that illusion, then it will end. Then you free yourself of the problem. Exactly as the physical body is in complete order when it is healthy. When it falls sick, there is a cause for the sickness. You go to the doctor, he eliminates that cause, detects that cause, and the body comes back to health. In the same way, there is a cause for the disorder in consciousness. And therefore, it can be ended by eliminating the cause. But you don't know what the cause is. It lies deep within you in the form of an illusion. These illusions lie at different levels of our consciousness. At the very superficial level, they are what we call superstitions. You can get rid of them even with scientific inquiry and intellectual inquiry. Then there are a lot of cultural illusions. The attitude which men have towards women is a cultural illusion. For thousands of years, it has been held that men are superior, women are to assist the man, and they are not really colleagues or friends. A sort of belief which has no basis, and you can see that it has led to a lot of domination and cruelty perpetrated by men towards women. And it's so difficult for man to change from that state because it has become a tradition. All over the world, but very strong tradition in India. You see consequences of it in the form of female feticide and so on. If I may take that as an example, as an illustration of how these illusions create that. Behind that is this whole casteism. You belong to a caste. Now that caste itself is something that is imposed on the child when it is born. A false notion which divides people. Anyway, he grows up, belongs to that caste, and in that caste, he lives by a certain structure where he accepts that the girl has to be married and belongs to another family, leaves this family and goes and belongs to another family. Paraya dhan. So the girl cannot be of much use to this family. That's the reason why boys are preferred and girls are not wanted, because they will go away. And more than that, you will have to pay a dowry to get them married. And therefore, they are treated as a burden. And that is at the root of this infanticide. You can't stop it just by law. But if you change this whole structure, because that whole structure is based on certain illusions simply constructed by thought, wherein you treat the girl differently from the boy right from childhood, and so on. So if you free yourself of that, free yourself of this casteism, let the boy and the girl study and work and marry whom they wish and so on. Not treat them as property belonging to the family. The family's responsibility is to look after them and help them grow. Then the whole attitude becomes different and all those problems disappear. But so long as you accept all this structure, calling it our culture, all this cruelty is perpetrated. Same way about so many other cruelties like young women getting married and then their husband dies, then the widow cannot marry again if she is belonging to a Hindu family and so on. You have to see through that. But if you call it your culture and you become proud of it, you don't see the cruelty in it. Similar things happen in a different way in the West and in Islamic society and so on. So all this disorder comes from certain illusions in our mind and you have to free yourself of those illusions. That is what freedom from conditioning is. So there is the factual part of the conditioning, which is useful. And there is this illusory part, which is just, it has become true for one because one has accepted it. But it is simply a construct of somebody's thought, which you are taking to be true. And you are therefore calling it your culture and not seeing the defect. Deeper even than these cultural differences are the psychological problems which psychologists try to solve, which are complexes, which arise from ill treatment in childhood and so on. Those are still deeper in one's consciousness. You can get rid of it, but it's more difficult. And finally, at the deepest level of consciousness, there is this feeling of being a separate individual, separate me. Almost all sages have pointed out that that is also just a construct. It's an illusion, but a very pernicious and persistent illusion in our mind. So when we talk about freedom from conditioning, you are talking about ending all these false notions in consciousness. But we are not aware that they are false. We call them our culture and so on. So you must examine, you must question, you must doubt. Without that, no change is possible. That's why Krishna Ji wanted to create a different kind of education so that children can be brought up and introduced to this inquiry, not only the scientific inquiry or inquiry into social problems and things like that, but also this religious inquiry, the inquiry of self-knowledge, which is non-denominational. It doesn't belong to any particular religion. Unfortunately, society does not value this inquiry, has not valued this inquiry. Consequently, we just grow up being just like the others around us. So our problems don't end. The Arabs tell their children that Jews are our enemies. The Jews tell their children that Arabs are our enemies. The children grow up, the old people die, but these prejudices, this hatred between the communities is transmitted from father to son, and therefore the division continues. How will it end? Unless the child is taught to question, to inquire, to find out from where does this division arise, and not just accept whatever the parents have said or whatever tradition is saying. So you must look at things and question whenever you see a certain discrimination, a certain domination, a certain violence arising, it's an opportunity to find out what is wrong deeply. And if you don't change it deeply, only deal with the symptoms, you will never get rid of the disease. And that is why this freedom from conditioning is an absolute requirement for man. Without that, you don't have a learning mind. You have only an accumulating mind, a mind that is seeking power, wanting to dominate and defend and so on. You may have certain noble ideas and ideals, but they are not an actuality. They are just an intellectual property. Makes you feel good and noble. So I'll end it here. I think that, to me, these are the deeper implications of the idea of freedom from conditioning. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It was very interesting discourse. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Dr. Rao, would you like to say something, sir? Dr. Gajanan Rao? Dr. Gajanan Rao. Unmute yourself, sir. Dr. Rama Rao will come to the questions. Let's hear Dr. Gajanan Rao if we can. Dr. Gajanan Rao, can you hear me, sir? You have to unmute yourself. Unmute. Mr. Maheshwari, please unmute Dr. Rao. Jain Saab. Jain Saab.
मैं ख्याल से क्वेश्चंस आंसर पे चले जाते हैं.
ठीक है, ठीक है.
बाद में वो आ जाएंगे तो फिर उनसे समराइज करा लेंगे.
Okay, okay. So, Mr. Rama Rao, please go ahead and ask your question to Professor Krishna. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, sir. My question is, sir, you mentioned freedom from the known, the psychological process of freedom.
Yes.
Means unless until I'm alive, so I don't feel this psychological process won't go. So it means that if I want to have a freedom from the known, means I have to die. That is a psychological dying. Kindly respond, sir.
That may be the ending of the last stage of the ending of the ego, may be a complete death to this whole identification and freedom from the me and the mind. But it begins with this inquiry. It begins with the awareness that I don't really know what the truth is, that my mind is trapped in a lot of propaganda. The propaganda of my own culture, my own traditions, and so on, including the propaganda of patriotism, nationalism, all kinds of isms. And unless you inquire and learn to free yourself of the propaganda, you won't come to that die every day. It is very easy to say that, but it won't come that. So you begin with this inquiry. You don't want to free yourself from the factual memories which you have, because you need language, you need to function, you need memory. No faculty which nature has given us is completely unnecessary. You need imagination, you need thinking. To find its right place and to know what is the right use of these faculties, not right and wrong in some moral sense, but right in the sense that which leads to happiness, to health, to harmony, and wrong in the sense that which leads to conflict, which leads to domination, hatred, and so on, disorder in consciousness. So to discern that is the art of living. Now you can't come upon that art of living by reading a book, because it's like putting thought in its right place, putting imagination in its right place. And there is no way you can describe what that right place is. So you have to feel it through. You have to sense it. Like you do in an art. There is no book that can prescribe how to make a beautiful picture, but beautiful pictures are made. So it's something like that. This process of self-knowledge will bring you to that harmony and so on. And if you go deep enough, you may be able to die. So the deepest illusion, which is the illusion of the self. Have I answered your question, sir?
Thank you, sir. I got it.
Welcome.
But I got the intellectual answer, but I don't know how to handle it.
You can't, that I can't give you, sir. I can only give you the intellectual analysis. The actual perception I can't give you. You have to do it for yourself, and I have to do it for myself.
Thank you.
Trinesh,
Yeah.
you want to ask a question?
Yes, one small question. Sir, you talked about how the conditioning happens to a person right from the birth. And it looks like it is quite natural to get conditioned. And you also talked about certain people like terrorists and all who are unaware of their own conditioning or illusion that what they are doing is not the right one. My question is, in such a situation where I am unaware of my conditioning, where is the way out for that? You talked about two consciousnesses. One is the individual one and another is the universal part, which is directly linked to the biological organism. Will this second part help that person to come out of his own illusion eventually? Is there any such possibility? Thank you.
There are two faculties, the faculty of thinking and the faculty of awareness. Now, thinking arises from memory, and memory contains all these illusions with which one grows up. And therefore, thought is a colored instrument, and it's useful for describing what one is feeling or what one is thinking, but it's not very good instrument for discerning what is true and what is false, because your analysis itself is done with a ground and an assumption which comes from your conditioning. Fortunately, there is another faculty which comes from the universal part, which is awareness. Awareness doesn't belong to you. It is not a conditioned faculty. Therefore, it's possible, if one doesn't use too much of thinking, but uses awareness and inquiry, both of which are inherently there in human consciousness, to discern what is true and what is false. But normally we have overtrained the thought faculty through education, through school, through college, all the time analysis, debating. We have given tremendous importance to clever thinking. But that's not the instrument for truth. I'll give you an example by which you can test yourself. Look at the Kashmir problem. Can you understand the problem without taking sides with the Indian view? You will find it extremely difficult, because all the time we are reading the Indian propaganda, the Indian view, and they're taking sides with it, and we belong to India, and so on. Therefore, you will not even listen to what Pakistan is saying or what the other side is saying. And also you get caught in the same kind of questioning. Does this land belong to me or belong to them? Maybe the question itself is wrong. You should be asking what is good for the human beings who are living there, for the animals, for the plants, for the nature in that place. Not who is possessing that land, who is owning that land. So you begin with a wrong question and you go on analyzing and so on, and you create a division. The Pakistani does the same from his end, and there is no end to that conflict. And so many times we have reached on the brink of war, and somehow people have interfered and tried, but the disease goes on. You are more or less in the same situation in which you were in 1948. Unless you can have a friendly relationship, unless Pakistan and India can talk about it, that what is good for the people of Kashmir, let us both try to do that instead of trying to fight over whether it belongs. It's a completely different mindset, no? But when you start with your own mindset, you will end up only thinking like that. So how do you come to a different mindset? That is the kind of inquiry that is necessary to get out of, to be aware of one's conditioning and not just take sides with one's own opinions or those of the me and the mine. Without that, there is not even a beginning of learning. So Krishna Ji didn't say that, Krishna Ji said freedom from conditioning is the beginning of learning. There is no end to the learning. You begin to learn once you are aware that you are conditioned, your mind is in propaganda, and therefore you're willing to question what your own mind is telling you. So he said, live with questions, don't live with answers and opinions. Don't live. Your opinion may be an illusion. How do you know? How are you so sure that your opinion is right? All people who thought their opinion was right turned out to be the greatest villains, and people like Hitler and Mussolini and people who killed Christ or killed Gandhi, they were all people who felt they were right. So it's good to doubt your own opinion. Krishna Ji laid great emphasis on doubt, not doubt as suspicion, but to doubt your own conditioning, whether it is true. But if you don't know, and you don't know that you don't know, then you are in a trap from which nobody can pull you out. But if you know that you don't know, there is a possibility that you might learn. So it's a difficult. I am not suggesting there is any simple solution.
Thank you, sir. I think we have two questions, one from Meenu and the other from Sachitanandi. So
Sure.
Meenu, you're first. Yeah, Meenu.
Yes,
please go
sir.
ahead.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the question is, why is it that there is no seeking of this freedom? Because wherever we see people are in that, people, including me or anybody, everybody is in that trap of conditioning. So, and we have started probably liking the suffering that is that is in that. So, like, why is it that there is no seeking for this freedom, sir?
Because one is seeking victory for one's own view. One is not really seeking the truth. The truth may be very uncomfortable. It may be very disturbing. And unless you come out of this instinct of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, which is not only physical pleasure and physical pain, but also psychological pleasure and psychological pain. Unless you go beyond that, you are always caught in this trap of self-interest, and you are not, you may say you are interested in truth, but you may not really be interested in truth. So it's like a lot of self-deception goes on.
So I just have a follow-up question, sir.
Sure.
Is there anything that can trigger this this quest, sir? Like this seeking that I want to be free from this. Is there anything that can trigger this?
There are plenty of triggers. I mean, every time you experience sorrow, every time you fight with your husband or father or whoever, it's a trigger. It's a trigger.
Yes,
that why is the relationship deteriorating? And if you look into it, you will see that the self-interest on both sides is the real cause of the problem. And what is self-interest? It is the identification with one's own opinion, one's own comfort, and one's own profits, and so on. So to get out of that state is not to be partial to oneself. To be able to see the other person, also other person's point of view, the same way as you see your point of view. Not want to dominate with your point of view.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Now, Sachidanand ji and then George. And after that, perhaps Dr. Gajanand Rao. Yeah. Sachidanand ji.
So what place has responsibility when I speak of freedom, sir?
Sir, Krishna Ji talked about responsibility in a very large sense. He said, you are the world. The world is the way it is because you are the way you are. If you examine closely, you will see the truth of this. There is casteism and problems of casteism in India because the Indian mind is infected with casteism. It's not there in Europe, but something else is there because their mind is infected with some other illusion. So we are the world. And that means we are also responsible for everything that is happening in the world. I'll just give you one example. When Gandhiji was murdered, 30th January 1948, around that time, Krishna Ji was giving talks in Bombay. And somebody asked him at the end of his talk, sir, who was responsible for the murder of Gandhi? And he said, each one of you who is divided from his fellow man on the basis of religion, on the basis of nationality, on the basis of ideology, is responsible for that murder. Of course, the law caught hold of the man who pulled the trigger and hanged him. But what made Godse a murderer? When he was born as a child, he was not a murderer. He grew up in this society, a society which had casteism, which had religious division. And the child got infected with all that and eventually felt convinced that Gandhi was supporting the Muslims and therefore he should be killed. So who created that society in which that child grew up? All of us. So in that sense, it is our greatest responsibility to free ourselves of all these illusions which create division. and free ourselves of this condition. That's really the deepest responsibility. But we give to responsibility a very superficial and convenient meaning. If I'm a maths teacher in a school, I say my responsibility is just to teach mathematics to these children. That's my, so we define responsibility as just duty. Whatever duty you have taken on yourself is your responsibility. That's a very convenient definition. But if you understand that we ourselves are creating this whole world and what is going on in this world, then I must not contribute to it. So I must not contribute to casteism. I must not contribute to dowry. I must not contribute to infanticide. I must not contribute to discrimination of men and women, and so on, male and female. So it begins with you. You have to change yourself. That's the greatest responsibility. We are always wanting to change the other person. You can't. He has to change himself. But you can talk about this need to change oneself, which is what he did for all 70 years. That we are not able to listen to him and do that is our tragedy.
Okay.
Thank you. George, you want to ask something?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Actually, one cannot be aware of conditioning as an abstract. One is aware of conflict, of pain, of pleasure. Conditioning can be known only indirectly in relation to something. The conflict is the result of our conditioning. Conditioning is attachment, that is attachment to anything. And attachment is escape from the inner void or whatever it is. And it is the escape that strengthens the conditioning. So instead of going through the conditioning, can one see directly the attachment and the problem arises out of it? Should one go through the process of conditioning itself? That is my question, sir.
Yes, sir. So as I explained in my talk, the process of conditioning takes place right from the birth onwards. You learn a particular language, you grow up in a particular family, all that conditions the child. You can notice it in every child. If you have been in a school, you can notice all this. So conditioning is already happened. Question is, can you examine that conditioning, retain those parts which are innocent, which are useful, which don't create any hatred or division, and discover for yourself those parts which do, and free yourself of that conditioning. Not conditioning as a whole. You can't get rid of it. It's sitting there in your memory, in the brain. And it's not like something written on a blackboard which you can wipe out with a duster. It's sitting inside your brain, in the memory. How will you wipe it out? And how will you decide what to wipe out and what to keep? So there is no such possibility of doing that. The only thing is you have to begin from where you are. You have to start with simple questions like, why do I like people who agree with me and dislike people who disagree with me? Why do I dislike criticism? Why do I like praise? I mean, those are simple questions. And if you haven't even freed yourself of that or understood that question, no use talking about the observer is the observed and so on. When you come to that door, you knock on that door. But right now you are at the door of jealousy and anger and opinion, etc. So you have to begin from where you are.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Sir, Dr. Gajanan Rao, please unmute yourself, sir. Unmute. We are not able to hear you.
Dr. Saab has to call someone to unmute himself. He has to call someone. Dr. Saab muting and unmuting both at a time. Please, Dr. Saab, call someone so who can help you. From this end, we can't do it. And we are eager to listen you, sir.
In the meantime, anybody else?
दुबे जी आप खुद ही समराइज कर दीजिए.
Okay. Harshad has to say something. Harshad Parekh wants to say something.
Oh, sure.
Harshad, please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Are you able to hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
I can hear you, Arshad. Go ahead.
Okay. The real source of all our problems of psychological nature is this feeling of I or me. Now,
Yes.
when a question comes to us naturally, what is this me or I? From where does it come? Whether can it be observed? So that is what I learned from Krishna Ji. And he said that this sense of I or me, it is coming from thinking. And when from thinking, this thing called I comes, and then that I tries to change thought. So there is a duality between thinker and thought, and that duality is the source of all our psychological problems. So when I really read that, I was curious, can I watch the beginning of a thought? Because from thinking arises the sense of I. So if I want to see I arising, I have to go to the source of the thought itself. And to look at the thought clearly, one requires curiosity, honesty, passion, and a kind of freedom at the beginning is required to look how these thoughts arising. So as long as one has not gone to that state where one can see clearly the beginning of a thought, and that requires the freedom. So Krishna Ji says freedom is at the beginning. So this is our main problem, that we are not able to look at the beginning of how fear arises or anger. If it can be looked immediately, that means one requires an ongoing, effortless awareness to see what is happening. And as long as that awareness is not awakened, we will get caught into many problems created by me thinking. Thank you.
You're welcome. Quite right.
Dr. Gajanan has unmuted.
Yeah,
Yeah, but I want to respond to what Harshad has said. I agree with it, Harshad, because so long as one is using thought, you have rightly pointed out the paradox that arises. But Krishnaji talked about passive awareness. Now, our mind is deeply conditioned into thinking that one has to make some effort in order to acquire freedom or acquire truth or whatever you want to call it. And he's saying that conditioning itself is the self. The idea that I have to do something in order to bring about this, you are greedy to receive something out of it. That itself is the ego conditioning. So one has to be very humbly and passively watchful. you mentioned that towards the end of your statement, that there has to be you used a different word from passive or choiceless, but it essentially meant that there is no agenda to it. You are just watching in order to learn, not in order to become something or achieve something. So it's a very subtle kind of watching. That's the essence of the learning mind.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes. Dr. Gajanan Rao. Yes, sir.
Yeah, can I be heard? No.
Yes, yes.
I have a lot of questions or no question because Krishna has been so explicit in going into this programming process that ever goes on since birth, probably even before birth. I have this question in my mind very often, that if you happen to perceive or lucky to have insight into something of a part of conditioning of you which is strong, maybe I may be rid of it, what it is of me. Does that rid me of a lot of conditioning, a volume of it present in me? Or each time I have to perceive to be out of it? One. Number two, when you said thinking and awareness is universal, has awareness can also be part of thinking, or it's so separate? Or thinking can be out of the usual thinking of the source we have of a basic material, or thinking can reach the height of awareness occasionally. Is that possible? You think without anything as a base. Is it not possible? Or I'm a little confused between the two. You also said the mind and the me.
Let me answer this
mind
much,
exactly now.
Kajan, and I'll lose these points if you make several others. So let me respond so far.
Yeah.
First of all, I'm speaking from my understanding, and it may not be the same as what Krishna Ji meant or said. I can only speak from my investigation, which is based on what his questions he raised and so on. But the understanding is mine. I must own that. Not necessarily, you must not confuse it with Krishna Ji's. That's one point. In my understanding, awareness is a separate faculty from thinking. It is there even in the child when it is born. Thinking in the sense that language is not there in the child, he acquires it later on. And so he has probably a rudimentary thinking like what animals have, which is there without language. So the kind of thinking which produces self-consciousness and so on comes from this whole thing of wanting to achieve results, achieve something for oneself. And that's promoted in education all the time. You must stand first in your class, you must do this, you must do that, and you must make effort and so on. At a certain physical level, it has meaning. You have to practice something and make effort. But in the psychological field, you extend it to the psychological field. And here, it's the ego trying to get rid of the ego. And so that becomes very confusing. But you can be aware of the origin of thought, because awareness is something separate. You see, I not only think, but when I'm thinking, I can be aware that I'm thinking. So awareness is not thinking. Awareness is something apart from thinking. it's a sort of intrinsic capacity of consciousness. If you are not aware, you are unconscious. As a doctor, you know that when you put somebody under chloroform and so on, he's unconscious, not capable of thinking. But the moment you are conscious, you are aware of the surrounding and so on. You may not be aware of the inner states, but you are aware of the surrounding. So awareness is more intrinsic quality of consciousness. And if that was not there, the child cannot develop the capacity for language either, because language requires him to associate a sound with a word and with an object which he is seeing and so on. So the language develops subsequently because he has this capacity for awareness and seeing. Awareness is also includes all the senses. You're sensing it. You're not just thinking it.
But what do you say about this conditioning as a whole or in parts through evolution?
Yeah.
When you get rid of a particular conditioning, does it affect the other parts of conditioning?
Well, it's like if you break one habit, it gives you the confidence that you can break habits. And so you need that in order to be free from all habits. But otherwise you give up. You are resigned. You take it that this is inevitable. Then you don't even ask a question about it. When you think something is impossible, the mind doesn't go there. The energy won't flow in that direction. So the moment you have ended even one illusion, you know that I can end illusion. Otherwise, the mind takes many things for granted, which are not necessarily so, and that is illusion. For example, growing up in a society, there is a very common illusion that success means getting into a position of power and money and becoming successful and famous and so on. Now, that's a very pernicious illusion common to almost whole of society. Very few people are free from that, but it's just not true. It's a propaganda of society. And the mind is trapped into it. And then it tries to justify that and so on. So then you can't be free easily of that. So it will begin always with, when Krishna Ji said, you must begin near to go far, right? Which means you must deal with where you are, what problems you are facing, you must deal with those. But deal not at a superficial level. Deal at this deeper level of eliminating the cause of the problem. That's the examination which is needed, through awareness, through watching and so on. You can find that out. I don't say it's easy, but it's not easy. But you have to begin there.
Because there are deeper habits.
Don't know what total freedom is. Almost nobody seems to have come to total freedom, even though 70 years Krishna Ji was talking about it. So forget about.
I'm asking why not, Krishna. I'm asking why doesn't happen at all, and we are going on with it.
Yes. It means the barriers are very deep in human consciousness. This barrier of the ego and the self lies very deep inside human consciousness. So very rarely does a human being come out of it. And it's doubtful in my mind whether Krishna Ji actually came out of it or he was already born out of it. Because already Leadbeater saw that this consciousness was free. Krishna Ji also doubted that. So I think that our idea that we are going to achieve freedom is itself false. You have to question that. Freedom may not be something to be achieved.
Yeah, that's right. It happens.
Yes, it can happen. Krishna Ji has also said that you have to keep what did he say? He said you have to keep the windows and doors of the mind open if you want the breeze to come in.
Yeah.
But just because you keep them open, you cannot now insist that the breeze must blow. So it is something like you need also some kind of grace, or you may call it luck or whatever, inside.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
The time is full. So time is indicating that we should finish it.
Yes, you can end it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
But let me say thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Prof Krishna. Thanks, Dr. Gajanan Rao. Thanks to all the participants. We'll meet next Sunday again at the same time. Thank you for coming. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Krishna.
Thanks to all.
Yeah.
Thank you.